Hi, Atiye. Sorry for the confusion. I'm so glad you're able to join us.
No worries. Sorry, partially my fault for being off-site and fighting with people over access to the Wi-Fi. So
Yes, no, it's very difficult. Well, without further ado, we've given a little background on CUAHSI, and I gave a very brief introduction of yourself. But if you would, I guess, to save time, we will just turn it directly over to yourself. And I will just remind participants to please input questions using the Q&A function at any time during this talk. And then after Atiye is done speaking, I will help facilitate our discussion afterwards. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Atiye Martin.
thank you so much. Appreciate you. Good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Good morning, good evening. My name is Dr. Atiye Martin. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here with you today. And so what I'm going to do is just give a little bit of context on kind of some of the work that I've been involved with around racial equity, resilience, and how that relates directly to the types of process as well as goals and metrics that will allow us to be able to embed racial equity and social justice into our work. What I've learned is that in absence of being intentional about that, where we end up landing is with perpetuating inequities without meaning to do so. We don't mean to, but if there is no intentional effort to make sure that it is part of what we're doing in all ways, then we by default are in all instances in ways that are sometimes big and small, are causing harm to people without meaning to do so. So to take a step back, I'd probably say it's important for us to, in this world, in this space, and doing work together to understand each other's humanity. And so for context, I know you've gotten probably a formal introduction to me and my background, but I think the most important thing to know about me is that my husband and I have 5 children, 2 still at home, and we were both born and raised in Boston. And much of our early years as parents was really worrying and then deciding to take action on the fact that we were trying to raise 5 Black children in a society that was not designed for them to thrive, not designed for them to see themselves as powerful or deserving to be in certain spaces, to not have the of deference or the right to just be in certain roles and responsibilities without constantly being questioned and constantly having to prove yourself because you're starting with people's assumptions about who you are and your possibilities. And so that is what catapulted me into being able to think about, well, what should we be doing differently in order to be more intentional about how we are preparing our children for that reality. And in that process, we really landed with culture, right? The power of culture, and in a more practical way than oftentimes we talk about it. We oftentimes talk about culture in this very kind of inaccessible way. It feels like something intangible, impractical, and not important, when it is the foundation for everything. It's how we interact with each other. It's how we go through process. It's how we do our work. It's how we think about the problems of climate change. It's how we then develop approaches, solutions to address some of the challenges that we face. It's the how, right? And not just what we say on paper. We can put equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice and all these different words into documents, but that isn't enough in order to move the work forward, in order to move the needle forward. So that said, part of the how that impacted my real contributions at work is that I began to learn more, to have better language, to be able to help people connect the dots to those realities, to acknowledge that we're just people and we're flawed and we're biased, and that is our default. And if we accept that as our default, then as we're thinking about, well, how do we do climate mitigation, climate adaptation, climate resilience, overarching, work better, right? What does that look like? Because the answers to that question requires us to look at things a bit differently. It requires us to step outside of what we think we know about communities and peoples and groups and actually engage with them, interact with them so that we can have a better sense. And usually through that process, we actually learn that there is no homogeneous communities, right? One Black community is not the same as another Black community. One Latinx community isn't the same as another one. One Asian community isn't the same. And there's lots of variation within there. And as we start to better understand these things, that we're able to better respect the complexity and nuance of reality and the interconnectedness, the interdependence of real life. So from a context setting perspective, I just wanted to share that with you because as I have grown in this work, it has been about academics and the nerdy stuff and, charts and arrows and formulas and models and all of those things, geographic information systems, all that stuff. But the ways that I have used those tools and the ways that I have worked with teams and departments and cities and different organizations to do that kind of work is different now from where I was, let's just say, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I've had these evolutions for me as a person to be able to think differently and approach the work differently and partner differently. Just because I'm a Black person doesn't mean that I understand the plight of all Black people, right? Just because I grew up poor doesn't mean that I understand the plight of all poor people, right? And so it's that a certain level of humility that allows us to be able to do this work better. That humility allows us to stay curious. That humility allows us to be in spaces with other people and not get distracted by the bias, the infection of ideas that we have about who different groups of people are and how they're supposed to be. And so as we think about the opportunities that we have to really kind of move the needle on this work, part of it is about all of the tools and the structure and the process. And it's also about our ability to show up fully present, managing ourselves, continuing to learn how to listen better, continuing to learn how to communicate better, continuing to learn how to navigate conflict because we're dealing with hard issues where there are lots of different opinions, lots of different spectrums of understanding about the actual problems and how complicated they are. You're dealing with a lot of differences, and not just because of people's identity, but because of the different understandings about these issues. And so how do we translate that into the work? Well, part of it is about navigating conflict, right? Part of it is about our ability to think critically. Critical thinking is an important skill in this work. Our ability to stay curious, to not fall into all of the mental traps that we oftentimes fall into, even though some of us are academics, right? Even though we're using things that seem objective, we're just people, and we bring ourselves and our lens to the work, and it colors how what we focus on. We can't focus on everything, right? So what we think we know about the world influences our ability to see the full context of a picture. And so that combination of communication, critical thinking, and conflict management are key in addition to our emotional intelligence, because we are emotional creatures. I know these are weird things to be talking about when it comes to flood mitigation and in the work, but all of these things influence how we do the work. It influences the things that frustrate us. The assumptions we make influence what we see as the problem and therefore the solution. Our assumptions and therefore fear of certain people or groups or things influences whether or not we use avoidance strategies in terms of interacting or engaging in any kind of real meaningful way. And so if we're able to accept these realities about our humanity, because we're just people, then it allows us to create the space to actually do something about it, to manage it, to learn some new skills we didn't have, or to improve some skills that we have, but we haven't invested in. And sometimes we have these skills, but we kind of get into a rut. And so we forget about managing ourselves, because now we're kind of on autopilot. And anytime we're on autopilot, it's likely we're not using any of these skills. If you don't feel like you're doing it, if you're not thinking about doing it, then you're probably not doing it, at least not doing it well. So those are the opportunities we have on the humanity side, the how we do the work side, right? And then there's, well, what's the work? So I'm going to do the awkward transition to sharing PowerPoint. One moment. I try not to pretend I can multitask, because it is not a thing I can actually do well. Okay. And let me share my, go into presentation mode and share my screen. Okay, here we are. Thank you for extending me some grace to be able to transition. So when we think about, one of the things that you probably heard in my introduction is that I am the CEO and founder of an organization called All Aces Inc. So I will do a little bit of the obligatory about just context, and then jump into some examples about what I just kind of primed us for leading into this. So for us, we have a vision that's really about making sure that we're able to help facilitate resilient communities that have the humanity to create inclusive spaces, and that they have the humility to learn, and the hope to re-envision, reimagine, and take action to help create a more racially equitable, social just world, starting with ourselves and our organizations and the work that we do. So with that context, most of the stuff we do is pretty straightforward, but it all centers on racial equity and resilience as an entry point into understanding other forms of oppression, and being able to help folks identify really meaningful actions they can take. And one of the important ways we do that is through our intentionallyact.com community. And it really is the foundation for the work that we do, because it supports our mission, which is to activate consciousness, catalyze critical thinking, and transform capabilities that advance racial equity and help to build more resilient communities. Again, remembering that kind of bioecological model, right? That, the people, the communities, the organizations, and the larger systems, structures, which sounds a lot like resilience talk, right? It's all interrelated. The frameworks are very similar for a lot of a lot of different bodies of work. So thank you, Julio, appreciate you. So as we think about our work and our mission, then the reality is one of the things that, let me go back before I get to that part. One of the things that we've done is a project with the Lower Mystic area for the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, which is Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts area. And so it's 5 cities and towns, 2 neighborhoods, including 2 neighborhoods within Boston, that they really were trying to look at how do we conduct a climate assessment that will be most helpful to us to actually advance resilience, to build resilience, to increase or improve resilience. And so intentionally what they decided is, instead of just looking at critical infrastructure, we're going to look at critical infrastructure and critical infrastructure assessment and social vulnerability. And we're gonna put those two things together so that we can have a more informed picture for how we look at the challenges we face with climate change, particularly around flooding, to to how that would then inform critical infrastructure investments, right? Which are usually what we do is we say, you know, critical and interdependency, network analyses, to be able to share with folks, you know, here's what our risks are based on here are the threats. In this case, you know, we're talking about flooding from climate change. Here are the vulnerabilities. And usually when we say vulnerabilities, we're only talking about one kind, infrastructure. And here are the consequences, and therefore here's the risk, the potential loss. And in that you miss the larger complexity, right, of how the world really works, right? Because just as critical infrastructure has interdependencies, so does all the other domains of resilience, if we want to use that framing, right? So for many of you, you know about kind of the four major domains of resilience, and I'll add a fifth one, right? So many people talk about infrastructure resilience. That's what I just finished talking about, right? That's where we generally spend a lot of time. Economic resilience, sometimes we get there. We talk about environmental resilience. You know, we've been talking about some of that in the context of climate adaptation and mitigation under the umbrella of resilience. And then we also talk about social. And we usually talk about social as like, you know, that thing on the side, right? That's separate from everything else. It's rare that we kind of connect the dots across those themes to show the interconnectedness of those things, the interdependencies of those things. And so by looking at the social vulnerability paired with the critical infrastructure, we're able to break down some of those silos we've created and really look at some of those deeper interdependencies. So what I'm going to walk you through is kind of the process that we went through in order to put together the final report, which will be coming out within the next month or so. I'm very excited about that. So now I'll show you this. So when we talk about these resilience domains, there's the fifth one I said I was going to add, which is governance. We oftentimes talk about governance and kind of as an afterthought, right? So we think about all these things and we're like, oh yeah, like government, we generally put it on local government or state government to like figure it out. But the reality is a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the social realities, environmental realities, economic realities are not just government, right? It's government, private sector, nonprofit. And in many cases in a lot of large cities around the country, around the world, it's actually those really large nonprofits who are having big impacts as well, right? If you think about hospitals and you think about higher education institutions and all the campuses and infrastructure that comes with that, right? They're part of critical infrastructure, and there's a governance piece there, right? And so it's hard for me to plan around these things if I'm not including those realities. There's also the people reality. There are real people who live in communities and they have information that's important for the process. They have interests, vested interests in seeing this go well too. And so really looking at how do we understand these domains of resilience and what the literature says about the different ways these different resilience domains connect to priority populations. And we use that language intentionally. It doesn't imply that some groups of people are more important than others. What it's saying is that if we prioritize understanding the challenges and needs of folks who are marginalized in our society and have more complex, complicated situations going on, then that means it's going to be better for everyone. Because even if you currently today are not dealing with a particular marginalized identity, like being temporarily disabled because you broke your leg, right? Then the world looks very different to you. And so if you ever find yourself in that circumstance, right, it's nice to know that you've been considered as part of a process, and the world will be not as challenging because someone was thoughtful about what that means in the larger scheme of things. And in the context of this work, really looking at how the research connects the dots between these different resilience domains to the experiences of priority populations. And so we did a link analysis that then allowed us to better visualize what is it that, what are the things that show up the most in an analysis that we can use to put together a survey in partnership with community-based organizations. You saw that 40% on there. I didn't really explain that. I'll go back, this 40% here that was on the screen. That's how much of the contract that we received that was spent partnering with community-based organizations. And so we took 40% of the funding and directly contracted with community-based organizations. And the way that normally would happen is we would get all that money and then we would ask partners to do it for free. You say, hey, can you reach out to a bunch of folks and share this stuff, right? But they're the experts. And not only are we asking them to share stuff, we're asking them to provide their context expertise. Just like we're content or technical experts, they're context experts. And so they have information that's important for us to be able to do this well. And so in working with them, we were able to really narrow the scope of the world to identify some key themes. So the one I have on the screen for you from that analysis that was probably very interesting at the time and was paralleling what was happening with COVID-19 in terms of the impact of lack of access to childcare in schools on families and households writ large, right? And so what we saw is that the different points on the network analysis showed us that for priority populations, there was this really unique cluster of childcare in schools to housing to income and employment, right? And there was a particular connection between employment and childcare, as well as businesses and childcare. So you don't see those other parts of the ginormous link analysis on here, just a representation of it. We also use that network analysis to identify what are the major critical infrastructure sectors that we really need to make sure we cover in this particular survey. In parallel to what we were doing, we were also working with Raub to be able to do the critical infrastructure assessment, which we did through a tabletop exercise with over 70 critical infrastructure managers across that region. Everything from energy related infrastructure to utilities, to municipalities, emergency managers, folks who are responsible for transportation infrastructure, a whole range, healthcare. So we had this breadth of infrastructure partners who had just finished going through a tabletop exercise. And so we also brought that information in to our process to understand, okay, we know that we had these partners who were part of these critical infrastructure sectors. Then what does a network analysis tell us about which critical infrastructure sectors we're able to, we should focus on, right? So there's what came out of the exercise and what came out of the analysis, and most of it overlapped with one exception. A partner that was missing from the table that it turned out to be key was actually information technology in infrastructure, communications and information technology. And so that's kind of everything from cell phones to computers to the landlines that connect us, all of that infrastructure, and which was proved to be particularly critical in COVID-19, but also in the context of what the research showed as something that was really important for us to pay attention to. So although we didn't have a partner in the critical infrastructure part that we were able to have as part of that tabletop exercise, it showed up in the research as being critically important. And when we put the survey together, we connected all of these dots for community members, and we worked with those community-based organizations. We gave out $50 gift cards to community members who fully completed the survey. And then we followed up with them to share. We're actually in the process of following up with them once the final report is finished, to share with them the results of that survey. Some of them we followed up with. We also did a series of focus groups in partnership with our community-based organizations. Those focus groups really allowed us. Yes, DeCarlo, I'm pausing for a moment. DeCarlo asked, is the methodology of the network analysis and social vulnerability survey available? Absolutely. Happy to share that with you once the official report is released. It's kind of embargoed right now, so we can't really share it until the actual Resilient Mystic Collaborative kind of gives us the blessing that it's okay to start sharing. But we absolutely will. Thank you, DeCarlo. So stay tuned. The other part was started to go as the focus groups, right? So we had focus groups, we did the same thing, $50 gift cards, and we actually pulled a lot of the focus group members from folks who took the survey, because it then allowed us to get more context on some of the answers we got. We did focus groups in Spanish specific, in language specific categories. So we did Spanish, we did English, we did Portuguese. And so we tried to match the focus groups to what the languages spoken in that particular region were. And so that worked really well. We were able to get more sophisticated information and answers from folks. We then integrated all of that stuff to be able to put together the survey. To be able to put together an analysis of the survey. So that we could do the kind of the data analysis part, right? So we have the surveys, the focus groups, and this data analysis piece. And part of the analysis was about, well, what are the infrastructure implications based on the responses people gave from the survey and the focus groups? What does that tell us about our infrastructure priorities that we need to have? Does it tell us something different than if we had just looked at critical infrastructure? And it turns out it absolutely did tell us different things that were, some of them were intuitive and some of them were counterintuitive. So I'll talk about one of the counterintuitive ones that I had anticipated as someone who worked on the critical infrastructure side early in my career as part of kind of doing Homeland Security, not working for the Department of Homeland Security, but doing a lot of Homeland Security related work. And part of that being around critical infrastructure. So understanding all the sectors and the interdependencies and what you look for vulnerabilities, all those pieces. So because of that, I was able to kind of look at this from a little bit of a different lens. And one of the things I used to always see in those years, this is kind of like right after, and it's early years right after 9/11, was that a lot of organizations did not have strong business continuity in the sense of, do I really understand my employees? Do I really understand where they live, what the realities of different neighborhoods they live in are, what they would need if we needed them to come when there was an emergency, right? Those are the types of things that usually the business continuity manager would be doing. In many cases, HR had the information, but maybe not the emergency manager as part of their regular flow of information and data, which means that I don't really understand when the geographic, not just the geographic distribution of my employees and getting them to the right places, but also I don't really understand the challenges my employees might be experiencing in getting here to the office and then being able to get home and what they need to do that. So all of that to say, as part of the critical infrastructure vulnerability assessment through the tabletop exercise, we actually learned that pattern still kind of exists. There were a number of partners who did not have an explicit connection to data and information that helped them to really connect the dots to where their employees lived. And if you don't understand that, then it's hard to understand some of the challenges. For example, there are certain places you can live in the city of Boston where it takes you twice as long to get to other parts of the city than your fellow Bostonians because of infrastructure inequities, right? Transportation inequities. So if I don't understand that, then I'm struggling to understand what's wrong with my employees versus what I can do differently in terms of preparing for that as a reality. That's not going to be a surprise to me because I understand those nuances. So all of those that is one of the more, so the counterintuitive piece is that when we looked at the social vulnerability survey data, almost 20% of the people we surveyed in our tiny sample size, it was, over 400, about 450 people that we surveyed in this area with a lot of support from our community-based organizations, not just to us, but to the actual residents to complete the survey. But about 20% of the people actually worked for critical infrastructure. And those are just the ones who like identified the work that they do with the categories that we had on the survey, right? Which is always danger of surveys, right? It's like people have to interpret it. But even with that, 20% of the people we surveyed actually worked for critical infrastructure, and to be explicit, we made sure that we focused on people who were part of priority populations. So people of color, Black people, Latinx people, Asian, Native American, and other indigenous groups, the whole range, people with disabilities, older adults, people who are low income, the whole range. And those can be completely different identities, and that can be one person who falls into all of those categories. And so really thinking about giving you that context for intentionality, because it says something about the connection between priority populations or socially vulnerable populations and critical infrastructure, that there's actually a relationship that we don't oftentimes think about, that we experienced during COVID-19. And just as quickly as we experienced it, we forgot about it. That the people that we depended on to run our critical infrastructure were many of the same folks who fall into these different categories. That said, the survey data helped to connect that dot in a real way, in a way that was an assumption that I was very explicit about with the project team, so that my assumption was less likely to influence kind of the actual work on the ground and how we framed questions. So there was some intentionality there to not let my bias influence how we frame things in the process itself. But it was an assumption from the beginning based on my previous experiences and some of the data. So now we have survey data that connects the dots for folks. So now our critical infrastructure partners can see, when you look at the distribution of where these folks live, they're living in very vulnerable areas geographically, right? And then you layer on top of it the social vulnerability and the realities of different resources that are available in different communities, and therefore additional challenges that present themselves for folks being able to navigate. We used the 2015 winter snowstorms in the region as an example for folks who lived in the region during that time. And for folks who don't know, that's like 5 weeks, every Monday into Sunday, of blizzard-like snowstorms that dumped feet of snow into Boston. It got so bad that we were running out of places to put snow. There were mounds of snow as high as street signs all throughout the city. Yards were full of snow. So that's some context. And that significantly impacted our priority population folks who were connected to critical infrastructure, because they still had to go to work, even though the city had to shut down every week for 5 weeks, for at least a day, sometimes longer. Our public transportation system completely shut down, and only in some instances ran some buses on some limited routes, but that was it. And so the disruption to the employees who needed to get to certain places, the increase in costs, economic costs, and turmoil for those families, because they didn't have an option but to go to work, many of them hourly. And so these are the types of considerations for us as we're thinking about mitigation activities, and how we think about kind of processes for getting there. I'll give you another example. So I was the Chief Resilience Officer for the city of Boston. I was the first Chief Resilience Officer, and we were the only city in that network to integrate racial equity and social justice into our plan in a real way, not just having a preamble up front that says, hey, we really care about these things, or a vignette, right? But really saying, okay, in every resilience domain that we lay out in this strategy, we're going to be explicit about how do we leverage the opportunities to implement infrastructure changes, consider the economic development, things we need to be thinking about, what are some of the environmental specific considerations, kind of all of these different buckets that are generally siloed. We created a throughput across them that said, you know, we can't be resilient as a city if only some of us have what we need to be resilient, if only some of our communities have been invested in a way that allows them to navigate the challenges that we face collectively as a city. Like, that is not resilience. That is only some people having resilience, which doesn't mean that we are resilient as a city, particularly if over 50% of your population are people of color, particularly if so many people are struggling with being kind of working poor. City of Boston has a very high cost of living. And if, as well as thinking about kind of some of the ways that our communities are designed and money that we've invested in those communities. So all of that said, it meant that we needed to take this different approach and use and look at resilience from a transformative resilience perspective, right? That we're not going to just bounce back. We're not just going to look at, well, what would it take to get things back to where they were? What are the things we can do to improve the situation? It's not just infrastructure. Like, we struggle with just doing that, right? We struggle with, you know, about, well, how do we build back infrastructure better than it was before, so that we don't fall into the same traps and consequences when we experience disasters and emergencies, particularly from climate change. But really, how do we make sure that we're taking every opportunity to address foundational issues in our communities through the investments we're making in climate adaptation, mitigation, and overall climate resilience? And so that means, let me give you a concrete example. Oh, let me change the slide because that might make some people dizzy. So part of the reality is that in order for us to create the kind of zero carbon, some folks have, some cities, including Boston, have kind of this, you know, carbon zero goal. In order to do that, there's actually a lot that has to happen on the economic development side. Why? Because much of the greenhouse gas emissions that happen in many cities, in most cities, is from buildings, right? And so we have a lot of buildings in an old city like Boston that need to be retrofitted. Estimates are as high as like 200,000 buildings need to be retrofitted. We do not have the current amount of businesses or individuals who can do that kind of work to be able to reach that many buildings, right? To retrofit that many buildings, which means we actually have to have an opportunity to build out our workforce and our entrepreneurial base. And in doing so, we can make sure that we're embedding racial equity and social justice into that, and making sure that the communities who are disproportionately bearing the burden of climate change are also reaping the benefits from the work and the money we're spending on trying to address these issues, right? So not that they're the only one to benefit, but we're being intentional, because remember, in absence of that intentionality, we perpetuate the inequities without meaning to do so. And so part of the process for the Boston Resilience Strategy, in order to get to a place where we can have a report that was representative of the realities of people, we did a ton of community engagement with no budget. So I know a lot of folks think you have to have a lot of money. You know, I won't lie to you, it's a lot of work. But if we want to do this well, most things that take a lot of work that most things that are important to us and that have the greatest impact require a lot of work, and that's just what it is. And so being able to engage with folks where they are, because what we oftentimes do is the opposite. We create space and we say, well, you all need to come to this space so that we can learn from you, as opposed to where are people in communities who we're trying to reach, and let's go there, right? And the reason that's important is because in absence of that, you get all the same people, right? The people who can come to the meetings that we create the spaces for, but no matter how awesome we are at thinking about, childcare and, maybe even stipends for folks to come and all of these things, there's still people who cannot be in those spaces on a regular basis to be able to fully contribute to the types of processes we oftentimes set up to try to work through planning issues, particularly when in this case, when it comes to climate resilience. And so as we think about, what does that mean? Well, that means riding buses. We rode buses to talk to people. We rode the trains to talk to people. We went to community events, again, partnered with community organizations who are already connected to real people in the community, particularly the folks who oftentimes never set foot in any of those meetings. They don't even know those meetings are happening because they're too in the middle of real life to be paying attention to what the city is doing or something that was on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. They're in the middle of real life. They're picking up kids, they're dropping kids off, they're trying to get to work on time, they're catching 2 buses to a train and having to do all of that in reverse. And then they got to get dinner on the table. Those are the real realities people are dealing with. They're not paying attention to us in our meetings. And so we have to go to where they are. And so the community partners we worked with were hosting events, right, that they already planned on hosting, that people in the community were used to coming to. And so we went to so many events that I cannot tell you, literally dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of events all across the city within communities that are socially vulnerable or priority populations, but also in affluent communities, right? Also, oh, sorry. Hopefully y'all can still see me. Okay, there we go. Often in, we went to, more affluent communities because we wanted to get the full breadth and depth of kind of what people were struggling with and what they wanted to see happen in the city, really centering though, those people who we do not often hear from. And what you have seen on the screen, you've probably read all of them while I was running my mouth at this point. Like these are the things we heard from folks, right? That who we were able to have all these different conversations with, whether they were at events, one-on-one conversations, whatever the case. And at those events, we would do like mini workshops and kind of give people some context and all of those pieces. We got some questions. David put in the chat, in the question. I really appreciate the methodology, but how does the concept of trust fit into your resilience framework? If a community at large does not trust each other due to racial, socioeconomic barriers, corruption, et cetera, then true resilience cannot be achieved. Once again, trust is important and building it takes time. David, you're absolutely correct. Trust is an important part of this. And for the sake of time, I won't go into the weeds on that, but what I will say is the bigger trust challenge we saw was actually between communities and government. Right? There's a lot of challenges people have had with government, and not just socially vulnerable people or priority populations, right? People who were just navigating. And here's why. Because the dysfunction, a couple of things. The dysfunction that we have in our systems and structures, organizations, process, anything like that. That dysfunction just always disproportionately burdens people who are already socially marginalized and isolated in our society. We experience the pain points of society worse than the rest of society. It doesn't mean that the rest of society isn't experiencing it. It means that those folks are experiencing it more profoundly for lots of different reasons, historical context, all that stuff. Now, then when you talk about communities trusting each other, I think there's an and I'm going to be really explicit about this because I don't have time to kind of try to be more flowery with language. I think there's more trust than people realize across communities. And we don't see those representations because they're not the ones who are on social media and on TV and on all these other platforms. The people who are on social media and on all the platforms are usually the extremes of the spectrum. And then there's the rest of the what they oftentimes refer to, I'm not crazy about it, but the silent majority, right? The folks who are like in the middle of like doing real stuff. So there is trust in communities and in relationships. The challenge becomes when we are not able to bring experiences, like when we're coming into the picture, particularly in this instance from the lens of government or academia, when we're coming into communities, it's important that we recognize these dynamics are real, right? Like there's this perception that there's this tension between communities, right? When in fact, the communities are dealing with a lot of the same issues. They're dealing with a lot of the same challenges, and helping people to make those connections helps with that. The other piece is that I was going in as government. It doesn't matter that I'm a Black woman. It doesn't matter that I grew up poor. It doesn't matter, none of that stuff matters, right? I was coming in as government, and that was what what I was basically kind of acting on behalf of in these moments. So I had to own the responsibilities of building trust with folks and being honest and being open and being vulnerable as a human being with people so that they can see my humanity, but also that they can see my intentions and that my desire to make sure that my intentions and the impact aligned. And that the only way that that could happen is with them, right? Otherwise, I'll be doing a bunch of stuff and I'll mean well, but the impact will be off because I didn't take the time to learn from the people whose experiences I'm trying to influence and trying to support. And as part of this larger work towards helping to improve resilience in communities. And so thank you for asking that question. Really appreciate you, David. And then David also, yes, STPs, well done, sir, well done. The same 10 people who show up to meetings, yes. That's a real thing, right? It's like always the same people. And there's a reason, because those are the people that have the time privilege to be able to show up in those spaces. So we're down to our last minute, and what I'll land with here is in doing this work that we challenge ourselves to be better and do better. My favorite quote came from a Salada Teabag, which is, most people don't recognize opportunity because it comes disguised as hard work. This is hard work, but it is our greatest opportunity in order to address the real foundational challenges that are in our ways of really having resilience that is not exclusive, right? Resilience that means something to people in communities, and that it's not a buzzword and it doesn't feel elitist, but that it's actually something that's connected to their everyday experiences. And we as academics and practitioners have to do a better job of helping people connect those dots to their day-to-day lives in this work and the benefits between the two. So thank you, Kristin, for holding me accountable to time. I appreciate you all. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Just in the last minute, do you have any opportunities to collaborate or connect with all ACEs that you'd like to share with the community? And are you open to receiving emails and contacts from anyone in the audience?
Absolutely. Number one, intentionallyact.com is where you can kind of see some of the ongoing work that we're doing. It's our combination of a online community and a learning platform with lots of free stuff in there, as well as kind of ways that we like to keep the folks who care about these issues updated. And then the second thing would be, please do share contact information. I'm happy to, and I'll also drop my LinkedIn link into the chat so folks can connect, and I'm happy to follow up. So And I will do that as you say your special closeout words.
I don't have many words, just a very wholehearted thank you to you. This is a very strong way to wrap up our series. Just a reminder to everyone that the recording of this session will be available on the YouTube CUAHSI YouTube channel, as are the prior 5 sessions from this series. And thank you very much. And yeah, we'll stay on the line just so you can get your email out. And thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending today.